Alright, let's go ahead and finish up the last few frames of our animation. So in the next few frames, what's going to happen is our explosion is going to start turning into smoke, and then that smoke is going to completely fade away. So let's add a new layer, and I'm going to go ahead and turn off all of my layers except for this last layer that we just created. And then on this new layer, I'm going to select a gray color. So I'm going to come down into my grays, and I actually want to add a little bit of some warmth to it. So I'm going to come over into the more saturated side of my grays, and I'm going to come down into my oranges. The reason why I'm coming into my colors to give it some warmth is because if I keep it over here, it's going to appear blue next to my orange. And that's the reason for that. So we'll go ahead and hit OK. And now we're going to start painting in that smoke. So switching over to my brush tool and bringing the size up, we're going to start painting in some circles for smoke. Now what you need to understand about this frame is our explosion is beginning to dissipate, and so our circles are going to start spreading out. They're not all going to be touching each other. So we might have some over here, we might have one here, two here, and so they're very spread out now. Let's bring our brush size down so we can get some other variation in there. Great. So something like that should work. Next, we want to go ahead and add a new layer above this, and then we're going to right click that new layer, and we're going to come over to where it says create clipping mask. So now this layer is a clipping mask for this gray. So anything we paint on this layer won't go outside of this gray shape. So let's go ahead and select our dark orange color back here. And then using my brush tool, I'm going to go ahead and paint in the tops of these by creating circles like so. Whoops. Now at this point, you also don't just have to create dots. If you want, you can go ahead and make some swirling motions with your mouse or your drawing utensil, and that'll make the process just a little bit quicker. Next, we want to select this light orange back here, and at this point we can go ahead and turn off this background layer. We don't need it anymore. And what we're going to do is we're going to paint on this layer, but at 50% opacity. So the way you change the opacity of your brush is by hitting the numbers on your keyboard. So if we hit the number 5, that's going to change our opacity to 50%, which means we're only going to be able to see through it 50% of the way. So if I paint that in, you'll see it's a lot lighter than usual. It's half as light actually. Now we're going to go ahead and select that color. So we have our mid-ground color. That's the color between our original color and this orange. Kind of like a mix between the two colors. Then I'm going to switch back over to my brush tool and hit the number 0 on my keyboard to bring my brush opacity back up to 100%. So now if I paint with this, you'll see it's the exact same color, but it's not see-through at all. So now we're going to go ahead and paint in some spots like so. And we want to keep these pretty spread out. And then we want to select our lighter orange color that we originally had. So over here in our color swatches, we can go ahead and select that color. And then we're going to go ahead and paint in some spots, whoops, like so. You want to keep these pretty spread out and within the orange areas. Now I forgot to add some orange here, so I'm going to quickly go ahead and paint that in. Great, so now we have our 5th frame. Let's go ahead and merge these two layers together. So now those are one. And now we're going to add a new layer for our next frame, and we want to select our gray color. And then with this, it's going to be very similar to our last frame, but we're going to have less smoke and it's going to be spread out more. So we want to bring our brush size down so that these smoke areas are much smaller. And you want your smoke areas to be generally in the same spot. So as it dissipates, we want our smoke to be moving, which is why I've kind of moved around where my smoke is, but it's generally in the same spot as where the smoke was last. Now let's go ahead and add in our oranges. So I'm going to select my dark orange color, and then I'm going to only paint within my gray areas like so. Now lastly, what we want to do is we want to select this mid-tone color that's between our dark orange and our light orange. So we're going to select that. Then we can turn off this back layer so we can see what's going on. And we want to paint on top of this dark orange color, just like so. Remember to keep your orange within the dark orange. Great. So now we just finished our 6th frame. Let's go ahead and add in a new layer for our 7th frame. And we're going to select our gray color. And then we want to do the same thing again, but even smaller. So this stuff is really going to start dissipating. So we'll have one there, maybe one spread over here, another one about there, and another one over here, maybe a little tiny one next to it. Maybe this guy has turned into one small little smoke piece. This guy and that guy. Add one there, and maybe one there. Now let's go ahead and turn off our back layer to see how that looks. So as you can see, it's almost just a bunch of circles now. Let's add one more layer for our last animation frame. And on this one, it's going to be very similar to this one, just even less. So we might have one there. We might have a tiny little one there. This guy might turn into a tiny little guy there. This guy might just be one, and this guy might sort of morph into two. And this guy might shrink down. So now let's go ahead and turn off our back layer to see how that looks. So it's hardly anything. Now I want to turn down the opacity on both these layers, so as they dissipate, they also become more transparent. So starting with this one right here, I'm going to go ahead and bring down the opacity to about 50%, and then the next one, I'm going to turn that on so I can see it. I'm going to bring it down to 25%. Great. Now let's go ahead and run through these really quick to see how the animation plays out. So I'm going to turn on my frame 1. So first it starts out as a small explosion, and then it gets bigger until it completely explodes into fire. And then in the next one, the heat starts to dissipate. The explosion is still getting bigger, but the colors are turning more towards the orange side because it's cooling off. Then in the next one, it starts to really dissipate and become smaller pieces of an explosion, and you also start to see some of that smoke in there. Then in the next one, it's mostly smoke with small pieces of heat and fire, and then in the next one, it's all smoke, and then in the next one, it's almost just tiny little dots of smoke in there. Now let's go ahead and set this up as an animation and see how it plays. So we're going to come down here to our timeline and hit Create Frame Animation. And we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 frames. And we want to leave a blank one at the beginning and the end. So I'm going to add in 10 frames. And then we have one of our layers turned on. So I'm going to select all those and turn our last frame off. And then starting on frame 2, we can turn on our layer 1 or frame 1. And then we can move on to frame 3 and move up to the next layer or the next frame. And then move on to the third one, the fourth one, the fifth, the sixth, the seventh, and the eighth. So now let's go ahead and run through those and see how those look. So we'll start on 2, then it gets bigger, explodes, begins to cool off, begins to dissipate, starts turning into smoke, becomes complete smoke, and now you can't hardly see it at all. So let's go ahead and select all of these, and we're going to change their time play. So we're going to come over to Other, and we're going to type in 0.03, And the reason why I'm typing in 0.03 is because that's about 24 frames per second, which is how much most animations play by. Go ahead and hit OK. And now we can go ahead and play that. Great. I think that looks pretty good. Now, if you're following along or you're planning on creating this project, I think you'll be pretty impressed with yourself once you see your final product. This isn't a really hard animation to do, and it looks amazing. Now, your assignment for this section is to create the same exact animation, but I want you to do something different to it. I either want you to change the color, or maybe even add an effect like a glow to each one of your frames, whatever you want to do. Once you've created your animation, go ahead and create a sprite sheet for it and save that out. Then I want you to post that to the Q&A section of this course so that all the other students can see the work that you've created. And I'd love to see your work too. Thanks for watching this lecture, and I look forward to seeing your animation.